Welcome, everybody, very cordially at the conference for the media, investors and analysts on the earnings of TAURON Capital Group for the first 9 months of 2022 and the third quarter of this year. Let me first introduce the host of today's meeting. We have President Paweł Szczek, the President of the Management Board of TAURON Polska Energia, and Mr. Krzysztof Surma, the Vice President of the Management Board responsible for the finance, the CFO. My name is Łukasz Zimny. I'm the press spokesman of TAURON Polska Energia. Traditionally, the basic information, the presentation will be conducted in Polish with a simultaneous interpreting into English. Outside of the broadcast, you can also listen to today's meeting via the teleconference mode. I'd like to encourage you to ask questions via the form available on the broadcast website. The only option to ask questions is to use this form. So the time has come to make a presentation, and then there will be a question and answer session. So, Mr. President, please have the floor. The floor is yours. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome during the earnings conference call on the TAURON Group's results for the first 9 months of this year and for the third quarter of this year. In my part of the presentation, I will describe the financial situation of the group, the highlights, the events that took place since we last met in September, and the capital expenditures, while the CFO, Mr. Krzysztof Surma, will present the macroeconomic situation and the detailed financial results broken down into the individual lines of business of our group. Let's move on to the slide number 2, the key data for the first 3 quarters of 2022. On this slide, slide number 1, excuse me. On this slide, we are presenting the operating and financial results achieved by TAURON Group in the first 3 quarters of 2022. The financial results during the period under review were under the pressure of the situation on the energy and fuels market. The rapid growth of electricity price and gas and coal are reflected in the sales revenue posted. On the other hand, we have an increase of operating expenses, so the earnings were strongly impacted by the outage, the shutdown of a 910 megawatt unit in Jaworzno, which led to the need to repurchase electricity on the power exchange in order to fulfill the contract that TAURON Group signed. As a result, the net profit that we posted was lower than a year ago. The EBITDA for the first 3 quarters of 2022 went down by 23%, down to 2.8 billion PLN, while the net profit fell by 14%, reaching 395 PLN. We, however, increased significantly the capital expenditures. They went up by 33% and achieving 2.6 billion PLN in the reported period. The volumes posted by the group in terms of electricity production and distribution were relatively flat, while regarding the operating data, a 14% decrease of heat production is noteworthy, which was a consequence of warm winter at the beginning of the year and an 8% decline of commercial coal production, which was due to the need to carry out some retooling of the headings at the coal mines owned by TAURON Group. Let's move on to the next slide. On the next slide, we are presenting the data that covers only Q3, the third quarter of this year. Similar as in the data for the first 3 quarters, you can see an increase of sales revenue and a decrease of profits. The net debt to EBITDA ratio came in at 3.3 at the end of the third quarter. It is worth looking at the changes in the operating data in the third quarter. The electricity production and distribution and supply are noticeable, the declines, which are first of all the result of decreased business activities, business operations that will be elaborated upon by President Surma. A 30% decrease of commercial coal production is a consequence of what I mentioned before, the need to retool the coal faces, and the cumulative effects were seen in the third quarter of this year of such activities. Let's move on to the next slide, the summary of the highlights of the most important events of the first three quarters. On this slide, we are presenting the most important events that took place until the date of publishing our earnings for the third quarter, namely today. Since the majority of them I already described when we were presenting the earnings for the first quarter and for the first 6 months of this year, let me focus on the most recent events now. As indicated on the slide, the green turn of TAURON is beginning to pick up steam. In the third quarter, we completed the construction of 2 wind farms, Majewo and Piotrków, with total capacity of 36 megawatts. We also purchased new renewables projects in development with a total capacity of about 70 megawatts. It's worth mentioning here that at the advanced stage of analysis, we have several further both wind and photovoltaic projects with a total capacity of around 600 megawatts. In accordance with our strategy, by 2025 we want to have 1.6 gigawatt, so 600 megawatts in renewables, and by the end of 2030 as much as 3,700 megawatts in renewables. The breakthrough from the point of view of our energy transition, at the same time a long-awaited event, was the signing of a contingent agreement of divestiture of our TAURON Wydobycie subsidiary to the state treasury. The transaction should be finalized at the end of this year, probably on the 31st of December or January 1st next year. Currently, we are waiting for the fulfillment of the last suspending condition defined in this contingent sale agreement. In parallel, the process of spinning off the coal generation assets to the National Energy Security Agency, the spinning off of the majority of the coal assets out of TAURON is the most important strategic project in our company over the last few years. Its completion will unlock the capex potential of our group and will clearly, significantly, markedly bring us closer to the achievement of a green turn of objectives. Also worth mentioning about the affirming of the Fitch ratings TAURON's long-term domestic and foreign currency ratings at BBB with a stable outlook. It's also a pleasure for me to inform you about the best of the best for the highest quality of annual reporting in the competition run by the Institute of Accounting and Taxes. Let me now hand over the floor to President Surma, who will continue the presentation. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, in terms of the macroeconomic environment, during the year the conditions have been very diverse, have varied. PMI especially, which indicate way ahead of the economic situation in Poland. We have a significant drop, about 40 points. Everything below 50 means a significant economic slowdown or a recession in the near future. A second important indicator for us is the electricity consumption in Poland, and here, for the first time since the pandemic shutdown of our economy, we are dealing with a decline of electricity consumption in the quarter 3 of this year. In terms of electricity production itself, since Poland still was a net exporter of the first 3 quarters of this year of electricity, so we are dealing with an increase of electricity production despite the decrease of the consumption in quarter 3. And an important piece of information is the fact that we have a significant increase of renewables production output, mainly as a result of a strong increase of PV panels installed. Even among households edition, we are dealing with a significant decline of production from gas, which the reason being quite obvious: the Russia's aggression against Ukraine and an increase of gas prices on the market. This you can clearly see it in the results for the first 3 quarters. An important piece of information is a transfer of the production between the hard coal and lignite. It's also due to the higher prices of hard coal and the limited supply of this coal on the market, especially in Q3. Moving on to the results of our group, we are dealing on one hand with a good result, almost 50% increase of sales revenue. However, the bad information is that this increase was accompanied at the same time by a more than 50% increase of the operating expenses, of the cost, which had effectively led to the decline of a net profit year over year. The net profit reached, after the first 3 quarters, around 400 million PLN. In terms of EBITDA adjusted by one-off events related to the transactions on the CO2 emission allowances market, which was one-off transactions back in 21-22, and the effect on the provision for the onerous transactions meant that 3 billion PLN was a recurring EBITDA, and it was after the first 3 quarters, or as compared to the first 3 quarters of last year, was lower by about 10%. Those weaker results are especially seen in the results of Q3 alone. You can see that in Q3 alone we reported a loss. At the consolidated level, EBITDA year over year was very low. The details and the reasons for this event I will elaborate upon when I discuss individual segments. If we move on now to the global results of all the individual segments, the key segment that is a backbone of the entire group is the distribution line of business. Here, stable, positive results year over year, and negative impact on the earnings came from the generation segment this year. And also it's worth noteworthy to look at the supply segment, which after 2 weak quarters rebounded. You must remember that this segment includes several areas of operations, and all those areas of operations had a positive contribution to the group's EBITDA in Q3. If we look at the Q3 alone results, here you can see even more clearly the weak results of the generation line of business and the relatively good earnings generated by the supply segment. I will elaborate on the details when I discuss the individual segments. If we look now at the EBITDA for the first 3 quarters of 2022 versus EBITDA for the first 3 quarters of 2021, here we can see that clearly that practically all the segments made positive contributions to the EBITDA except for the generation segment. This segment was so negative, but unfortunately the positive contributions of the other effects were offset by this negative impact of the generation segment's results. If you look at the Q3 alone results, here we even have a smaller number of segments that made positive contributions to the group's EBITDA. As a matter of fact, we are saying that it was supply and mining segments. However, in the mining segment, as we mentioned before, we are saying anyhow about the negative EBITDA in Q3. I will elaborate on the details when I discuss each segment. Let's move on to the distribution segment. Our key subsidiary, here we have stable growth year over year. EBITDA higher by about 100 million PLN. Here, an important piece of information is such that this EBITDA was positively impacted by the higher rate of the fees for electricity distribution. However, the negative impact came from the costs, wages, cost of external services, outsourcing, and the cost of taxes paid on the grid assets. If you look at the Q3 alone in this segment here, the first 2 effects that I mentioned also had the same impact. So we are dealing here with an increase of revenue and an increase of revenue due to the increase of the rate approved by the President of the Energy Regulatory Office for the year 2022. On the other hand, a negative impact coming from the cost of wages, payroll costs, and the external services costs. In addition, what's worth noting in this third quarter is a reversal of the cost of covering the balancing difference. In the previous 2 quarters, we had a positive balance of the upward adjustment. Here in Q3, we had a negative, it's a downward adjustment, so we had a negative impact on the results of the distribution segment. But all in all, it offset the positive impact of the first half of this year in this respect. And the second effect, which is worth noting, which also correlated to the decline that I mentioned at the very beginning, the consumption of electricity in Poland is more than 3% decrease of the distributed electricity volume, which had a negative impact upon the results of the distribution segment. If we look at the key parameters, here practically all of them have been met, have been maintained, so basically they shouldn't have a material negative impact on the future tariff in the distribution segment. Let's move on to the renewables segment. Here an important impact came from the increase of the prices both on the electricity market as well as the property rights market. Those price increases had a positive impact upon EBITDA. In terms of the volume of electricity generated from renewables, it's almost flat year over year. However, there is an important allocation between individual segments, a much higher production output from the wind farms. Let us recall that in 2021, the production of wind farms was historically low. This year we rebounded into the solid historical average. However, we had a very low output, production output from the hydropower plants. A low level of waters meant that the production is the same, but the source of its generation has changed. In terms of quarter Q3 alone result in the renewables segment, here we are dealing with this price effect still being positive on the earnings. However, we are dealing with a significant material decline of the volume, mainly from the output on the hydropower plants. It means that year over year the earnings are very similar. In addition, we had slightly weaker results on the prices of the property rights, which as a result of the consequence led to the comparable result year over year. If we move on to the segment that had the biggest negative impact upon the earnings of this year and of this quarter, namely the generation segment, several aspects should be highlighted here. The first one is the high base level effect. Let us remember that last year we were dealing with a cost plus contract, which we mentioned several times during the earnings call. That was a contract signed between TAURON and Nowe Jaworzno. This contract led to the transfer of a margin between the generation segment and the supply segment, as a result leading to the better earnings in the generation segment. On a accrual basis, 2021 it was about 700 million PLN for the first 3 quarters of 2021. So we're dealing with a high base level, high reference level. So if you compare, to have the comparable results year over year, you would have to reduce this result, the earnings, by 700 million PLN. Nevertheless, even if you adjust for this high base effect, it is materially lower year over year. The 2 issues. The first issue is the effect of the high coal prices, which had a significant impact, material impact upon the deterioration of the results of quarter 3. And as a result of those high coal prices and the renegotiated contracts by all the mining companies, as well as TAURON Wydobycie subsidiary, TAURON Mining, which means a certain transfer of a positive margin to the mining segment, meant that at the same time we have contracts in place for the electricity supply sales on the power exchange at a fixed price, which means that we are incurring losses. And we incurred such a loss in Q3, which required setting up a provision also for Q4. This provision was set up for the second half of the year, and it's continued also for Q4. That's one of the reasons for this large negative result. The second reason is the shutdown of the unit, which is clearly visible when you look at the results of Q3 alone. We had an unplanned, unscheduled outage at Nowe Jaworzno in August this year. This failure also coincided with the highest electricity prices this year, reported this year, so the company had to repurchase the electricity that it sold before at very high prices. So paradoxically, in Q3, when there were very high electricity prices on the exchange, on the market, and normally the generation segment would take advantage of that, could sell additional electricity that was not sold under the long-term contracts, could have sold such electricity on the spot market at high prices. Instead, we were dealing with a shutdown of the unit, the failure of the unit, so we had to repurchase. So paradoxically, the generation segment was a victim instead of a beneficiary of high electricity prices on the market in the third quarter. Moving on to the supply segment, as I mentioned, talking about the previous segment, we are dealing with a base effect. Here this base should be raised, so we would have started then from the EBITDA of around 700 million PLN in 2021. Comparing, if we were to adjust it to make it comparable conditions, we have a bit lower EBITDA year over year. Its allocation is also varies, it's different. It's worth noting that we are reporting very good earnings of Czech supply energy, and TAURON Nowe Technology also reported good earnings. However, the supply segment's EBITDA was reduced by the gas contracts, high gas prices on the market, and the need to purchase gas, and at the same time a lack of passing on the entire increase onto the customers led to the significant decline of the margin in this area during this period, almost 100 million PLN in total. Additionally, there was a negative impact on this segment is the profile of the customers, changes of prices during the day, or strong movements of prices during the day, which was not possible to be passed on onto the final consumers, and the G tariff not covering the full costs. It's worth looking at Q3 alone results. Q3, as I mentioned at the very beginning, after 2 weak quarters in the beginning of this year, even taking into account the base level effect that I mentioned, so the transfer of margin between the generation and the supply segments, here in Q3 it would have amounted to about 455 million PLN, this effect base. Still, the earnings of Q3 would have been better year over year. Here the key issue was the decline of the price in September and ability to have additional contracts at a bit lower price. If we move on now to the mining segment, in the mining segment we are dealing with, unfortunately, well, if we talk about cumulatively, we are still dealing with positive EBITDA. However, here the key aspect is, of course, the price effect. The price year over year went up materially, both on the market as well as of medium-size and large-size coal lumps, as well as coal dust sales, also including also to our generation subsidiary. But we are dealing with a decline of production volume, which I will elaborate upon more when I discuss Q3 alone. It's important that cumulatively this year, this effect of a decline of a sales volume didn't have a direct negative impact on the result, due to the fact that in 2021, some of the costs that were activated in the balance sheet were transferred because of the higher sales, and the sales of inventories was activated with a negative result directly in the P&L statement. We didn't have that effect in 2022, therefore we had a positive effect of the base level also in this regard. If we move on to the Q3 earnings of the mining segment, here the effect of declining volume had a negative impact. We didn't have such a large transfer of inventory last year into the results. And this effect, as the CEO mentioned at the very beginning, was due first and foremost due to the retooling of headings in the Sobieski coal mine. We had the peak overhauls of the type and the coal face retooling. Therefore, the mining output, extraction output from this coal mine year over year was very low. However, we expect in the next quarter that the extraction output will be at a good historical level. However, this quarter, due to this retooling of headings and coal faces, we posted a negative result in the mining segment, but we assume that the next quarter will be better. Moving on to the debt levels, the net debt versus the ratio, including the ratio, reached about 11 billion PLN. This is due to the difference in the cash balance difference, almost 1 billion PLN. Additionally, it's reduced by the level of debt under the hybrid debts, bonds. What the key issue, the maturity of the loans in December this year. We mentioned during the previous earnings conference call, on July 15, we signed a loan agreement with the consortium of banks, which this loan fully enables us to refinance the loan that is maturing, which was a bonds and was concluded in 2015. Therefore, we have no risk of refinancing, and what's important, also it's worth highlighting, also in 2023 we don't have significant maturities of significant loans, so the risk of refinancing in the near future is mitigated. So here I'd like to complete this part of my presentation. Let me hand over back to the CEO. Thank you very much. Let's move on now to slide related to the capital expenditures. Ladies and gentlemen, as I already mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, in the first 3 quarters of this year, the capex went up by 1/3 versus the same period of last year, coming in at 2.6 billion PLN. Based on the data that you can see in front of you on the graph, you can see that capex went up in all lines of business of our group. Traditionally, the largest funds, almost 1.5 billion PLN, was allocated to the distribution segment, with the majority of that amount spent on installing new grid connections, as well as grid asset refurbishments and replacements. Again, the renewable segment is worth noting, 300 million PLN on building 3 wind farms and 2 PV with a total capacity of 140 megawatts, and the overhaul, upgrading, refurbishing of hydropower plants. Versus last year, the renewables capex went up almost 6 times, which demonstrates that, as I mentioned before, that the green turn of TAURON is picking up steam. More than 270 million PLN was spent in the generation segment, mainly refurbishment and replacements of assets, also investments in the new capacity expansion and growth of heating districts and connecting to the heating network of new facilities. In the mining segment, the majority of funds was spent on the production preparation and the refurbishment and replacement task. The balance of the capex, mainly related to the IT infrastructure, came in at slightly less than 300 million PLN. Here I would like to finish our presentation. Let's move on now to the answers to your questions. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, a lot of questions were sent. I will try to read them one by one, unless some of them will be repeating themselves. The first question: what items in what values are included in the other services bar in distribution services in the graph showing the EBITDA for the distribution segment? I will try to answer this question. With respect to this, let's say, bar on our graph, on our presentation, there are 3 key items included in that area. The first one is the labor cost, and as I As I'm mentioning, also this is also the order that reflects the amounts, the values. So the key issue is the increase of the cost of labor. The second issue is the increase of external services costs. Those external services, outsourced services, include also services provided by our subsidiaries. What I mean here is the TOK, WGT, and other support subsidiaries that are part of our group. And the third category is the increase of the tax costs. Thank you. Next question, the distribution segment, the bridge EBITDA graph by in values. What is the adjustment balance in the cost of grid losses? What does it include? Why is it so high? The adjustments related to estimates. So what assumptions that were taken into account when making this estimate were not exactly in line with the reality, and why did those assumptions were so different from the reality? However, the balance of the adjustment, let me start with the results of Q3 alone, came in at around 60 million PLN, and this time, in this quarter, it was a negative balance. If we talk about the very fact how we calculate that, let's remember that this is balance versus balance, and as a matter of fact, it is based on the estimate of customers' invoice during the given period. There's a reference to the price of the distribution service in the given period, so it is not so that we make an estimate and then we adjust this estimate because it was wrong, but because of the balance in the given period is different from the similar period. It is worth mentioning here that, for instance, the balance changes or recently has changed mainly due to the issue of invoicing the prosumers, and simply they were invoiced differently. We also changed the systems in the meantime, in terms of billing those and setting accounts with those prosumers. So the balance of the adjustment was increased in the previous period, decreased in the current period. So one can say that in each period, in every period, this adjustment balance will be different and for different reasons. It was not due to the wrong estimates, but the difference in the balances in the individual periods. Another question, according to the company, the October 27th law on the freezing of the prices and the regulations of the 9th of November will allow for covering all the costs in the trading line of business. Is the company ready to take over the collapsing independent electricity suppliers? Well, to answer this question, we have to know what will be the level of the tariff agreed upon with the President of the Energy Regulatory Office. As of now, we are assuming that all the justified costs, according to the regulations, will be covered, will be included in the tariff, and thus the results of a segment should be positive, let's say, should generate some minimum margin. But of course, in order to answer this question, we would need to receive information on the tariff. The tariff should be approved by mid-December at the latest, so we are waiting for this piece of information. The next question, what's the opinion about the management board EBITDA in the distribution segment 2023? What are the factors behind such opinion, and according to the management board, the volumes and so on, how these factors will be evolving in this segment? Well, in terms of the result for 2022, we can still refer to here. As of now, we are assuming flat earnings in the distribution line of business, which is visible after the first 3 quarters. The factor that could have a negative impact upon the level of these earnings is the volume of electricity distributed. As I mentioned, Q3 was relatively weak in this regard. and we are dealing with an economic slowdown, so this may have a negative impact upon the earnings. Nevertheless, the full year result will be flat or slightly positive, slightly up year over year. In terms of 2023, first of all, the outlook in this regard is presented usually during the presentation of full year results, earnings conference call, and we are waiting, as I mentioned, talking about the trading line of business, waiting for final decisions of the President of the Energy Regulatory Office. The model is being finalized for the distribution segment. First of all, WACC and the level of WACC for the next year is being discussed. And the second issue, the level of covering the cost of purchasing electricity for the balancing difference. These two issues are key. And to answer the question regarding the prospects for this segment, we have to get the information from the President of the Energy Regulatory Office, which I do hope will happen by mid-December at the latest. And then, when we will be presenting the full year result, we'll be able to provide the outlook for 2023 for the distribution segment. The next question, if theoretically the generation segment were to be consolidated for the whole 2023, so the EBITDA of the segment 22 could have been better than the revenue from the capacity market. Well, here, first of all, let us remember that we are continuously dealing with the NABE, National Agency for Energy Security, so the basic assumption is that the generation segment will be transferred to the National Agency for Energy Security. So this is the first piece of important information. The second important piece of information, we are dealing with a legal act and with an act of law and a regulation that impose certain price caps. However, the key issue to answer this question is the price of coal for next year, and the negotiations are underway regarding this topic with the key mining companies in Poland. So to answer that question, what's the outlook for 2023 in the generation segment, conventional generation segment? So as a matter of fact, we would have to know the final price of coal. Another question, does the company similar to PGE expects WACC in the distribution segment to be at the 7.8%? What is the risk that it will be set at a lower level? As I answered in earlier questions, the application of the company regarding the tariff for next year, including the WACC level, has been submitted by the company. We are awaiting a response of feedback from the President of the Energy Regulatory Office. I don't want to give you a statement whether this is the level that PGE mentioned or not. I assume that within the next month we'll be able to disclose this information, and this information will be published. It's a public information. The result of a supply segment in 2023 should be positive, or are you considering setting up a provision in the segment in Q4? At what level, or at the order of magnitude? Which segment? Supply segment. Let me answer the question again. The result of the supply segment 2023 should be positive, or are you considering the provision in this segment in Q4? At what level? As I mentioned, we are dealing with this act of law which regulates the maximum profitability of the supply segment. Of course, since we are talking basically about the supply companies, let us remember that the supply segment in our case is both TAURON Nowe Technologie, it's a Czech supply company, it's TAURON Sprzedaż GZE. I understand the offer of the question is mainly referring to TAURON Sprzedaż and TAURON Sprzedaż GZE subsidiaries. Here we are dealing with the act of law. Both the act of law and the regulation determine the maximum level of profitability in this segment. We are talking about 3%, But the key issue, as I mentioned before, is the issue of a tariff approved by the President of the Energy Regulatory Office, since the prices for individual consumers, the households, have already been agreed upon, whereas the compensation and payment for the trading companies will be dependent upon the tariff approved by the President of the Energy Regulatory Office. Only at that time we'll be able to answer this question, what will be the earnings of the supply segment subsidiaries. The next question, how much net debt is assigned, allocated to the assets that are being transferred to the National Agency for Energy Security? Here it's worth mentioning, which we emphasize historically at TAURON Polska Energia, we have a central financing model in place. The entire financing is directly drawn down by TAURON Polska Energia. There is no direct allocation of debt to the individual segments. So as a matter of fact, the issue of assigning the debt is more of a secondary importance, because we'll be talking more about the intra-group debt, whereas the key issue in case of a transfer of the assets to the National Agency for Security is the valuation. As a matter of fact, it will be up to depending upon valuation, the level of debt will be dependent upon the valuation, because the parties could agree upon the higher or lower allocation of the debt agreed upon between the parties. So the key aspect is the valuation, how much money we could get, how much for the assets that will be transferred. The next question, will TAURON be able to post a EBITDA profit in the conventional generation of electricity in 2023, taking into account the latest decree of the government? Here, in terms of the regulation itself, the regulation specifies the maximum profitability of this segment. So to every megawatt hour, maximum margin of first degree profit to cover the capex and the cost of financing at very level of around 50 PLN, additionally 3% calculating based on the price on the spot or balancing market in the subsequent year. So it's not possible to describe it directly, but the key issues, the price of coal, hard coal, could be passed on, could be transferred, and the price of CO2 emission allowances. So the key to the answer whether the segment, what the result of the segment will be, would be the volume of electricity sold by this segment, and of course obtaining such price of coal which would allow us to generate a positive CDS, positive margin in this segment, which will allow at the end of the day to achieve the profitability indicated in the act of law. So today it's not possible, as I mentioned before, to determine the earnings, the results of the segment, having not finalized the negotiations with the coal mines. Okay, so the next question, supposedly the trade union members from TAURON, Wydobycie, TAURON Mining subsidiary, want 10,000 PLN for each employee for getting transferred from TAURON directly to the state treasury company. Are talks underway with management board of TAURON or the management of the National Agency for Energy Security in connection with the planned sale of TAURON Mining subsidiary to the state treasury? We are talking both to the workforce of TAURON Wydobycie subsidiary as well as the management board of TAURON Wydobycie. The workforce asks questions about the future of this entity, of this company, while it becomes a state treasury company. The workforce put forward certain expectations, both of financial and non-financial nature. The talks are underway. We want to complete this transaction by way of coming to an understanding agreement with the workforce. Next question is related again to the finances. In 2023, should we expect a significant increase of the financial costs? Well, of course, as I mentioned, we are giving this outlook during the presentation of the full year results, but it's not a big surprise here if I say that the increase of the costs will take place. It is mainly the consequence of base, so the increase cost, the increase of the WIBOR rate. Let us remember that last year WIBOR was around 3%. Today we are dealing with, we're talking, in our case, the main factor being the 6-month WIBOR. Today, the 6-month WIBOR is around 7.5%. So taking into account the fact that some financial costs are delayed, are lagged behind, so the WIBOR is set 6 months ahead of its actual implementation. So partly in 2022, we're taking advantage of a lower cost of financing as a base effect, considered as a base effect. Similarly, next year we'll have to pay some interest according to the higher cost of financing due to the increase of the WIBOR rate. The loan margins are at a similar level year over year. Here, of course, it's worth noting the level of financing that we have according to the fixed rate, and the cost of financing here will not change. An important piece of information is such that for some transactions, especially for the loan that matured in December this year, we had a transaction based on the fixed interest rate, the IRS transactions. Those transactions will expire. They were concluded at a lower interest rate level, and thus, versus with respect to certain part of this financing, the cost will go up, since the from fixed rate based on the IRS instrument will move on to the floating rate and based on the current WIBOR level quoted. The next question: has TAURON secured, hedged the price of coal for its power plants, combined heat and power plants, after the mining is transferred to the state treasury? We have contracts in place, active, which, irrespective whether TAURON mining subsidiary is part of TAURON Group or outside, those contracts are in place, are active, and will also be in place and working next year, both for our power plants and combined heat and power plants. Time has come for the last questions. How, due to the transfer of the assets to the National Agency for Energy Security, will be the bonds and the loans at TAURON? As I mentioned, the issue of loans and bonds doesn't change. The party for the financing agreements in the majority cases is TAURON Polska Energia. And TAURON Polska Energia will be, as it happened before, so far up to now, will be servicing this financing. So the key issue during the transfer of the assets to NABE is the question of the price that we managed to obtain during this transfer for those assets. And we can imagine then, on a transitional basis, taking into account our strategy and the growth and the transition towards the green energy and fixed capex in the distribution. So the cost of capex will be high in the long term, but on a transitory basis, we can imagine that especially those loans that, well, the RCF, that we can fluently pay them back and then draw more funds. Partly those loans could be paid back from the funds that we get from NABE, so on a transitionary basis that could reduce the debt level of the group. But the key issue would be the price that we obtain for those assets and how this payment will be spread over time. Ladies and gentlemen, this way we have answered all the questions that we have received already today. I'd like to invite you to our next meeting directly after we publish the report for the full year 2022. After, we will inform you about the date of this conference in a traditional way. So thank you very much for this meeting, and see you next time. Thank you. Goodbye.